Chieftain's Q&A number 3, August 2019. You guys are not running out of questions anytime soon, apparently. Quick admin note, if you want a significant emotional event t-shirt, there's only 2 or 3 days left before the orders are closed and they get sent to printing. If you are such a dimension that the t-shirt sizes on offer on the website do not fit you, send the EverPress guys an email. They're often able to manually configure a larger shirt than the drop-down menu permits. So that done, to the questions. And starting with Admiral Tiberius. What do I think the future of the Abrams tank and US armour is for the next 10 years? Could I see the M1 being fitted with an autoloader? Well, a short answer, I'd say it's going to look a hell of a lot like it is now with the M1A2C. That only just entered service, so there is going to be an upgrade program to that which will cover the next while, and maybe also some of the older A2s will filter down to the Guard. Or maybe not. It very well may be that the current A1SAs have some advantages over older A2s. Expect to see more active and passive defenses added to the fleet, and the addition of the programmable multi-purpose round, which is supposed to replace heat, MPAT, HEOR, and supposedly canister. Although I'm not actually sure about that last one. Canister has a couple of capabilities such as obstacle clearing, which I don't think the AMP round can handle. 10 years from now, I'd say, is when you will start seeing the prototypes start coming out for the next upgrade. The Army is working on a new tank, but there will be more Abrams upgrades to keep things going while it gets fielded. Outside of maybe a newer armor package, my guess is that they'll finally turn their attention to the turbine. Turbine technology has had 4 decades to improve. The AGT 1500 is getting a little bit long in the tooth. I'm not convinced, though, that they will switch to diesel engines. The turbine seems to have served the M1 in the US well. As for the autoloader, no, I don't. I'm a huge fan of autoloaders, but in the Abrams there are only 2 arguments in its favor. The only one I'm aware of that is feasible, by the way, is the Megget compact autoloader. One advantage is that it increases the ready rack from 18 to 34 rounds, which may also simply be solved by a carousel or cassette semi-auto system, and would only be an issue of facing massed evil enemy hordes. The other advantage is if you want the loader to primarily be head out, scanning for threats and manning the machine gun, let's say in a low intensity environment. And that's a lot of money that you'll be spending for just those 2 benefits without gaining the other advantages that an autoloader provides in tank design. Robert Henry Ilson inquires, did engineers of anti-tank obstacles and anti-tank defenses purposely build obstacles to force the undersides up and expose them to anti-tank weapons? I have been doing this long enough to know not to say, no, it never happened. However, I am at a loss to either recall any specific examples, nor any such example in the doctrinal manuals. If you're going to be shoveling that much dirt to make a mound, it's got to come from a hole in the ground that you just made, which is probably going to be a pretty good anti-tank ditch, which should stop the tank dead, which is better outcome than just presenting a vulnerable underside target. He also wishes to know if Japan or the USSR developed anti-tank weapons such as Piat, Panzerfaust, or bazooka. The Soviets started out like most nations with anti-tank rifles, the PTRD. However, that was kept in common service much longer than the Boys or the Panzerbuch. Much longer. We found them in Afghanistan. Like the others, though, it could only punch through lighter armor. One oddity was the Ampoulomet, which was kind of like a specialized Molotov cocktail launcher. You didn't want to get hit by it, as it was basically a phosphorus grenade in a glass bottle, but it wasn't really a great weapon either. Enter thus the RPG-43, a thrown hand grenade with a shaped charge instead of fragmentation. This will go through nearly 3 inches of armor, and the later version, the RPG-6, would go through 4 inches. Of course, it would only actually physically go as far as you could hoik it, and it was about as accurate. On the other hand, it was cheap. It worked when it impacted, and you could drop it out of windows. The Soviets did receive Piat and Bazooka as Lend-Lease, but only a few thousand, and the Soviets were not huge fans of them, although they had actually tested early models only. Japan, well, they went with rifle grenades, satchel charges, and mines, including lunge mines, which is basically a large heat charge on the end of a long, shall we say, not quite long enough for me to try its stick. After capturing some bazookas in 1943, an attempt was made to engineer an equivalent. Enter the Type 4 rocket launcher. A few thousand were made, and they were held in Japan for the defense of the homeland, and thus were never used. A more capable version was never produced in large numbers, that was a Type 5. A small number of recoilless rifles were also created, and some of those we use in Okinawa. Kazuki K asks, given the tendency of AFVs to be designed with a V-shaped hull, why hasn't the M2 Bradley been upgraded? Well, fundamentally it wouldn't be an upgrade, it would have to be a complete replacement, as in an entirely different vehicle, a much larger one. In order for the V-hull to be of any capability, there has to be both ground clearance in the center of the V and a good slope of the angle of the hull upwards and outwards. I mean, have you seen how big modern V-hulled APCs are? Think of it as the current dilemma equivalent to putting sloped armour on the top half of a tank in World War II, your pluses and minuses. You mentioned the AMPV in your question, but looking at images of that, it doesn't seem to be a V-hull. It's basically a Bradley. You might be confusing it with one of the competitor vehicles, the V Striker. The most innovative solution I've seen for mine survivability is a chimney installed in the middle of the vehicle which just lets the blast go up through the vehicle and out the roof. The US hasn't, to my knowledge, gone with it, but I believe the British might have installed some in their vehicles. During the Afghan war, were there any specific desert modifications to vehicles similar to the engine deck Troppen modifications on Panzers? I can't think of any, and I don't recall reading of any in my reference books. There were certainly combat modifications, most famously the ZSU-23 4M2 Afghansky, but I suspect that the Soviet vehicles are just plain designed to work anywhere from the beginning. Marcel Sedler, and apologies if I just massacred that name, how and why did the West fall behind the USSR in regards to armour and gun technology? The USSR used composite armour and smoothbore guns some 10 years before the Americans did. Even the MBT-70 used standard space steel and a rifle. One thing the Soviets were not was either stupid nor lacking in innovation or imagination. They were limited by the technology available to them, but coming up with concepts, such as composite armour, doesn't require technology. Sometimes they simply were brainchilds, and well, other times they were a solution to a problem which the West didn't think needed dealing with. Example, Western tank gun accuracy was considered such that they didn't need to mess with gun-launched missiles. The Soviets felt that the way to make up the gap was by developing accurate missiles. The Shillelagh is not a small missile. The main reason it was tried wasn't accuracy as much as the fact that it just had a really good payload and was going to blast any enemy tank it hit into little itty-bitty commie pieces, better than a heat or KE round from a cannon. It is perhaps a bit of a misnomer to describe the Soviet armour packages as composite. Multi-material might perhaps be a better term, the various layers of, say, rods being intermingled with metal. It worked reasonably well. Over on the US side, the idea of multi-material armour was being played with in the 1950s. The M60 has the straight front hull and the flat turret sides because it was designed to utilise a silica-based armour panel. It was found that the armour worked as advertised, particularly against chemical effect rounds, but there were problems setting up the manufacturing system in time to meet the tank production timelines. The budget wasn't really there for it, it was expensive, and there were concerns that after taking a knock or two, the KE protection would actually be worse than it would have been without the siliceous cord armour. The test reports for that are generally public and are on the DTIC or DTIC site. Something similar can be said for the smoothbore guns. It wasn't as if the West were unaware of the benefits. A semi-smoothbore was to be found on the T-49, and there were smoothbores such as the 90mm T-208E9 or the 105mm T-210. When arming the M60, the 208E9 was one of the competitors for the job, but they decided that on overall merit, the British 105mm rifle was the better tank gun. Don't forget, smoothbores do suffer some liabilities such as payload capacity. You have to leave room for the fins. If the British 105, which was a damn good gun, met the penetration requirements, there was no need to move to the smoothbore. Striker 1959 wants to know how I came up with the significant emotional event line. US Army. I fear I cannot take credit for it, and it's actually not all that uncommon. Indeed, I heard a lieutenant colonel use it at a meeting about 2 weeks ago. In my case, it came from then Captain Butler, my small group instructor at the Manoeuvre Captain's Career Course, who referred to a Russian Type 10 tank company which had just lost 4 tanks in a second as a result of a single volley of fire from an M1 platoon as having undergone a significant emotional event. It's kind of stuck with me ever since. SEO896 wants me to opine as to whether the Type 95 was a decent tank given that the Japanese did a lot of island hopping and it was sufficiently armoured to stop rifle fire. Now, I probably unjustifiably give the Japanese World War II armour short shrift. Like most designers worldwide, the Japanese designers were not idiots and they knew what they were trying to build and why. The main problem was that the Japanese were using a tank designed in 1935 to fight Shermans in 1945, and this is not going to go well. For a 1935 tank, though, it wasn't really all that bad. Look at the competitor vehicles which were in service around the world, and it's right up there. I don't know if the Japanese were thinking island hopping particularly, but there's no getting around the fact that a tank was going to get on a ship to go somewhere, and that somewhere probably had fairly limited infrastructure, i.e. bridges. Against basically anybody but the Soviets, the tank would have been perfectly fine against any likely opposition until the Americans and British started getting involved. It may not have been a fantastic tank even in, say, 1941, but when the enemy has a not fantastic tank and you have no tank at all, the nuances do become a little academic. So, you get an armoured vehicle with a couple of guns, capable of navigating around the Pacific terrain and being reasonably easy to lift onto and off of ships, with a rugged and reliable suspension and engine, the latter of which takes diesel. The design has much to commend it. James Morgan asks 2 questions, neither of which I have an answer for really. He wants to know how the T-34 fared in different theatres, given that, for example, M4 was tested to operate in all sorts of environments, and he also wants to know what M26 crews felt about their tank compared with Sherman. Now, certainly the M26 crews in 1945 were very excited to receive their new mounts. Bigger gun, more armour, what's not to like? What I haven't read, though, are the opinions of the crewmen who may have transferred from Shermans, or maybe even reverted to Shermans, after a fair bit of time operating the M26, and once the M26's liabilities started coming to the fore. So I would not be surprised if an M26 crewman of 1951 in Korea might have a different opinion on the relative merits of the tank compared to the Sherman operating next to him than an M26 crewman of 1945 did. Now, if somebody can link the suitable reference book, please comment below, because I'm kind of curious now. As to the first question, I've not heard any particular complaints. Obviously, the T-34 works well in Soviet winters and Ukrainian summers. It seems to have worked well enough in North Africa that conversions continued to be used after the T-34 gun tank was obsolete, so I can't really see that the desert environment was a killer either. Charles Charange. How effective are flamethrowers versus tank? Not very, but there is a caveat. Flamethrowers have a terrible ability to find small little gaps. It shouldn't be impossible for it to find a way through, for example through a vision port or a hatch seal, and then make life annoying for whoever is just behind it. It's unlikely though to cause any major damage. It is well enough known that Molotov cocktails and other such incendiaries can be effective against tanks, but what generally happens in these cases is that the fuel drips down into the engine deck gratings, air intakes, and the likes, causing fires to take place internally in places like the air filter, which doesn't do the tank's engine any good at all. If the flamethrower stream somehow is angled that it can direct down into a vent or an open hatch, okay, all bets are off. But from ground level, you're probably better off looking for a law. Yuso Alonan wants to know what is the fastest tank in the world, and he observes that there are various different definitions of tank, which could exclude Hellcat, Scorpion, etc. It is said that somebody took the speed governor off of an early M1, which was a lot lighter than the M1s are today, and it clocked in at over 80 miles an hour, and that the tracks did not appreciate it. However, in reality, you won't get an M1 like this to do much over 45, really, governor or otherwise. Those governors are there for a reason as well. So, according to Jane's Armour and Artillery in the chapter for MBTs and medium tanks, we're looking at almost all modern tanks topping out between 65 to 70 kilometers an hour. The winner, apparently, is the tank Argentino Mediano at 75 kilometers an hour. Although I do note that the Type 10 is supposedly able to do 70 kilometers an hour in reverse, which is probably going to make the driver clench. I'm not aware of any other tank that can go anywhere near that speed backwards. Witold Kujawski. Have I ever considered looking at tanks from the wrong end of the barrel? It's apparently quite scary. I try not to. But yes, on occasion in training you will see somebody's gun barrel pointing at you, and you know then that you've screwed up. Joe Bolloway. Would the Ram 2 tank have been any good had it seen combat? And it's difficult to say. In effect, what you're doing is you're trading the hull mounted 75 for a turret 57, given that Ram is basically a variant of the M3 medium. It was probably a wasted effort, really. There is a reason that everybody who could basically went from the 57 to the 75. The 57's HE effect, which was what tanks fired most, was well outclassed by the 75, which is why Armoured Force and the British Army upgraded to the 75 on tanks which could take it, whilst the AP round, although definitely better hole puncher at short range, was arguable at longer ranges due to the heavier 75mm projectile, which kept the momentum, and this is why Tank Destroyer branch decided not to take it either. The turret would have been a definite plus in close terrain, but at the time most of the fighting was going on in North Africa. It wasn't a bad design, but there's likely a reason that nobody saw fit to put it into the front line. Gaming Sentry wants to know how I got started working for Wargaming and what started inside the Chieftain's hatch. Well, I was playing World of Tanks over 8 years ago, and I noticed a post on the forum saying come meet the developers at a tank museum, and it turned out it was a Littlefield collection where I was one of the tour guides. At the time I was working IT for the TSA, so I'd asked the scheduler to put me on the tour, took a day off work, down I went. I really just wanted to say thanks for making a fun game, but this is everything you got wrong. Well, after the tour, the staff took all the players down to the local taqueria, and it turned out that the CEO, Victor Kisley, was in charge. And this is also where we started the idea of always letting folks know where we were if we're going somewhere on a business trip. As far as I know, most gaming companies don't meet up with random players just because they're in the area on business, but that's a tradition that Victor started. At the taqueria, Victor made mention that they were opening a new office in the San Francisco area. I asked if they were hiring. He said yes, so I sent my CV applying for an IT position. It turned out he wanted to offer me the position of tank god, his term, with an intriguing job description. Now, at this point, it should be pointed out that making videos and writing articles is not the majority of my job, it's just what's visible to you guys. I went home, told the wife of the time that I had a job offer. She asks, doing what? I said, well, what do you think about a dream job? You? Talk about tanks, ride tanks. Yep, that's it. She looks at me, says, what, am I going to pay you for this? Yeah, more than I'm currently earning. And the rest is history. Inside the Chieftain's hatch was developed as an advertising and recruiting tool. So the idea was that folks going to the Wargaming channel to watch the show would stay in the Wargaming ecosphere and play the game. However, by this time in 2019, I guess it's figured that anybody it's likely to reach has already seen it, so it's been sort of deprioritized. And this is why, as part of the restart of the series, at least for the 5 or 6 vehicles that are in the can, we're going to be very obvious about the fact that it's a recruiting tool and hope that people will sign on to the game using the Chieftain code so that they can see that it's worth making more of them. If they call it quits after editing and releasing those 5 or 6, well, that's why I started the Patreon and why I've been talking to various musea about making my own way there, separate to Wargaming. Although I have to say I've been burning a lot of my vacation time recently doing this sort of thing. Andrew wants more information about the BARV, the BARV, as seen in the History Guy's just released top 5 tanks. The BARV was one of the funnies created for D-Day after experience garnered in other landings. Based off of a Sherman hull, it looked a lot like the Centurion BARV you see in History Guide's video. The Aussies also made one out of an M3 Grant. The Centurion BARV replaced the Sherman and then saw service in the Falklands. The current BRV, no A, is a Leopard 1, making in theory the British are another Leopard user. However, they only have a couple operational, one each on Albion and Bulwark and a couple more in training. The obvious difference between the BARV and the BRV is that they decided, I guess, that the chances were that nobody would be shooting at the vehicle on the beach, so they changed the armoured superstructure to something which had a bit more vision. The Dutch also used something rather similar, also based off of Leopard 1, although interestingly I can't seem to find a purpose-designed vehicle in American use. Maybe they use Amtraks. Finally, Larry Cleve wants to know, was there any evidence that Black Prince was used in Korea as some websites claim? No. I've not seen any such evidence, and neither can I even envision any, given that there were never great vehicles in the first place and never adopted for service. So that is it, Q&A number 3. Again, this is a perk that a lot of the patrons get, and that said, I do scan through the comments in these videos anyway, just in case somebody poses an interesting question, such as the woodchuck thing, which kind of threw me. But you'll note that people were sensible this time around. Otherwise, keep an eye on the Facebook page. Chances are when this video comes out, I'm going to be 1 or 2 days away from Hawaii. There's a very short notice trip came up, so keep an eye out for a pub session there. It's going to be in Honolulu, and well, I'm sure people in Hawaii want to drink as much as I do. Yeah. Anyway, that's it. Take care. See you next time.